Mom. He said our name wasn't good enough to sit at his table. My son's voice broke in a way I had not heard since he was 8 years old, and for a moment I didn't answer, because I needed to be sure I was hearing him clearly, not just as a mother, but as a woman who had spent 72 years learning the exact weight of certain words. I set my coffee down on the kitchen counter, still warm, the clock above the stove reading 10:17 p.m., and I asked him one question, calm, steady. The way you ask when everything inside you has already shifted. Where are you standing right now? He hesitated, just long enough for me to hear traffic behind him, a passing car, the hollow echo of open space. Not a home, not a place where anyone belonged. Outside, he said quietly. He told me to leave, in front of everyone. I closed my eyes for a second, not in pain, but in recognition, because there is a tone a person uses when they have just been humiliated and are trying to hold the pieces of themselves together long enough to explain it, and I had heard that tone before. In different rooms, in different years, sometimes directed at me. Stay where you are, I told him, already reaching for my keys. I'll be there in 10 minutes, and don't call anyone back tonight. I didn't rush. Not in the way people expect when something like this happens. I moved with purpose, coat on, purse in hand, turning off the kitchen light before stepping out into the cold October air, the kind that settles into your bones if you let it. But I didn't let it. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove. When I saw him, he was standing under a streetlight at the edge of a driveway that did not belong to him anymore, his shoulders slightly forward, like he was trying to take up less space than he actually did, his jacket unzipped, hands empty. No bag, no box, nothing but the clothes he was wearing and whatever dignity he still had left, and I noticed his hands first, because hands tell the truth before a face does. They were shaking just enough to betray him, just enough to tell me this wasn't anger. This wasn't a fight he chose. This was something done to him. I pulled up beside him and unlocked the door without saying a word. He opened it slowly, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to get in, and when he finally sat down, the car filled with that silence that comes after something has already broken. Not loud, not dramatic, just heavy. I looked straight ahead, not at him, and said quietly, "Seatbelt," because some things you keep normal on purpose. And he obeyed like he used to when he was small, the click sounding louder than it should have in the quiet. We sat there for a second before I put the car in drive, and he let out a breath he had been holding too long. He said, "Our name wasn't good enough for his family, Mom." He said I should have thought about that before I married into them. I nodded once, slow, controlled, because words like that don't need immediate answers. They need to be remembered exactly as they were said, stored carefully, like documents you know you're going to need later. "Did your wife say anything?" I asked, my voice still even, and he looked down at his hands, those same hands that used to reach for mine crossing the street. "She didn't stop him," he said, and that was enough, more than enough. Because there are moments in a person's life where silence from the wrong person speaks louder than anything else, and I felt something settle inside me, not anger, not yet, something colder, something clearer. I turned the car onto the main road, the streetlights passing one by one across the windshield, and I said, "You're coming home tonight," not as a suggestion, not as comfort, but as a decision, and then, after a pause, I added, "And tomorrow we're going to take a closer look at exactly what kind of family thinks they have the right to measure someone else's name." I drove in silence for nearly 5 minutes before he spoke again, and even then it was not to explain, but to justify, the way people do when they are trying to make sense of something that should never have happened in the first place. He said it like it was obvious, my son muttered, staring out the window as the streetlights passed across his face in slow intervals, like everyone in the room already agreed with him. I kept my eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel, because I needed him to keep talking, not to interrupt him with comfort. "Not yet. Who was there?" I asked, and he swallowed before answering. "Her parents, her brother, a couple of their friends. It was supposed to be dinner, just dinner." I nodded once, the kind of nod no one sees, but you feel it in your own chest. "And what did you say?" He let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh, but it was not. I said nothing at first. I thought he was joking, but then he kept going. talking about where we came from, how our name did not carry anything, how I should be grateful they even accepted me. I felt that word settle, accepted, like it belonged to someone who believed people came with price tags and your wife. I asked again, softer this time, and he shook his head slowly. She just sat there, Mom. She kept looking at me like she wanted me to fix it, like it was my job to make her father stop without embarrassing him. I turned onto our street, the familiar line of houses appearing one by one, quiet, ordinary. Real in a way the place he had just come from would never be. So he asked you to leave? I said, already knowing the answer, and my son nodded. He stood up and told me if I could not respect their standards, I should not be in their house, and when I did not respond fast enough, he pointed to the door, and everyone watched. There it was, not the words, not even the insult, but the watching, the silent agreement of a room that decided who belonged and who did not. Did you walk out? I asked, and he hesitated again, longer this time. I did not want to, but I was not going to argue in front of them, not like that, so I grabbed my coat and left. I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine, the sudden quiet filling the space between us, and for a moment neither of us moved. Good, I said finally, and he turned to look at me, confused. Good. I met his eyes for the first time since I picked him up, calm, steady. Unshaken. You did not give them a scene to remember you by, I said. You gave them a mistake they will not understand until it is too late. He frowned slightly, like he was trying to follow something just out of reach. Mom, I think this is bigger than that. I do not think they want me back there. I reached for my keys and opened the door, the cold air rushing in again, clean and sharp. That is not their decision to make alone, I replied, stepping out of the car, and he followed me slowly, still carrying the weight of the evening in his shoulders. Come inside. I added, unlocking the front door, the familiar click echoing in the quiet night. You need to get some rest. He hesitated in the doorway before stepping in, looking around like he had not seen this place in a long time. The small living room, the worn couch, the lamp by the window that had been there for years, unchanged, reliable. I did not bring anything, he said quietly, almost apologetically, and I shook my head once, setting my purse down on the table. You brought yourself. That is enough for tonight. He sat on the couch, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together like he was trying to hold himself in place, and I walked into the kitchen, poured out the coffee I had left earlier, now cold, and rinsed the cup slowly under warm water. Because some things you do not rush, not when you are thinking, not when you are putting pieces together. Mom, he called from the living room, his voice lower now, worn down. What am I supposed to do? I dried my hands carefully, one finger at a time, and looked at the reflection in the dark window above the sink, not at the street, not at the night, but at myself. At a woman who had heard words like that before and learned exactly what they meant beneath the surface. You are not going to do anything tonight, I said, walking back toward him, my voice as steady as it had been on the phone. Tonight, you sleep. He looked up at me, searching for something, maybe reassurance, maybe a plan, maybe both, and I gave him neither. Not yet, and tomorrow, he asked quietly, and I paused for just a second before answering, because timing matters more than words. Tomorrow, I said, we find out why a man so concerned with names is so afraid of yours. He chose the stage, and that mattered more than he understood. Because people like him do not just speak in private, they perform, and once they perform, they cannot easily take it back. My son sat there for a moment longer, his hand still resting on the folder, his expression shifting from confusion to something steadier, something closer to resolve. They have a company event this weekend, he said finally, his voice quieter but more controlled. A dinner, clients, partners, family, everyone will be there. I looked at him without reacting too quickly, because timing is not just about action, it is about information, and you are expected to attend? I asked, and he gave a small, almost humorless smile. I was. Before last night, he said, and then added after a pause, I do not think they expect me to show up now. I leaned back slightly, letting that sit, because expectation is often where people make their first mistake. Good, I said calmly, and he looked at me again, this time with less confusion than before. You want me to go? He asked, And I shook my head once. Slow and deliberate, no, I replied. I want us to go. That stopped him completely, not because he did not understand the words, but because he understood exactly what they implied. Mom, after what happened, he began, but I raised a hand slightly, not to silence him, but to keep the conversation on the path it needed to follow. After what happened, I said, is precisely why we do not stay away. He looked down for a second, then back at me, measuring, thinking, they will not welcome you there, he said carefully, and I gave a small nod. I am not going there to be welcomed, I replied. I am going there because that is where he decided to define us. The room fell quiet again, not uncomfortable, just focused, the kind of quiet that comes before a decision is fully formed. What exactly are you planning to do? He asked, and this time there was no hesitation in his voice. Just a need to understand the shape of what was coming, and I did not rush the answer. I stood up instead, walked to the kitchen, and poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, letting the sound of it fill the space for a moment before I spoke. I am going to have a conversation, I said simply, returning to the table, the same way he did. He watched me closely, searching for something louder, something more dramatic, but finding none of it. That is it, he asked, and I met his gaze evenly. That is enough, I said, if you say the right thing in the right place, at the right time. He exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, and what if he refuses to listen? He asked, and I allowed the smallest hint of something to pass through my expression. Not anger, not satisfaction, just certainty. Then he will learn by consequence instead of conversation, I replied, my voice still calm, still measured, because I was not threatening, I was stating a fact. He nodded slowly, absorbing that. The weight of it settling differently than anything I had said before. You have done this before, he said quietly, and I did not smile. I did not confirm it directly. I simply held his gaze and said, I have learned when not to speak too soon. That was enough for him. More than enough, and for the first time since the night before, he sat a little straighter, not fully restored, not yet, but no longer collapsed inward. What do you need me to do? He asked. And I appreciated that question more than anything else he could have said, because it meant he was no longer asking what was happening to him. He was asking how to move through it. You are going to do exactly what you did last night, I said, and he frowned slightly. Nothing, he asked, and I nodded once. You will stand there, you will listen, and you will not react, I said, each word deliberate, because this is not about proving them wrong in the moment. It is about making sure they cannot deny what happens next. He sat with that for a second, then gave a small, steady nod. Okay, he said, and I could hear it in his voice, not confidence yet, but trust, and that was enough to begin. I took a sip of my coffee, set the cup down, and added quietly, almost as an afterthought, and you will watch his face, I said, because there is a moment when a man realizes he has misjudged something, and when that moment comes, you will understand exactly why I told you to remember every word he said. The day of the dinner came without announcement, the way important days often do, quiet on the surface, but carrying something underneath that only a few people can feel, and I dressed the same way I always had for years, a simple navy dress, low heels. Nothing that tried to compete with the room I was about to walk into, because I was not there to be noticed at first glance, I was there to be understood at the right moment. My son stood by the door adjusting his jacket, his movements slower than usual, more deliberate, like he was preparing himself for something he could not fully predict. Are you sure about this? He asked, not for the first time, and I looked at him calmly, the same way I had the night before. Yes, I said. I am sure about timing, and that was all I offered, because explanations lose their strength when given too early. The drive there was quiet, not tense, just focused, and when we pulled into the long, well-lit entrance of the venue, I recognized it immediately, not because I had been invited often, but because I knew exactly what stood beneath it, what contracts it rested on, what agreements kept it running without most people ever noticing. My son exhaled slowly as we stepped out of the car, his eyes scanning the building, the valet stand, the people moving in and out dressed in the kind of confidence that comes from never having their place questioned. They are all going to be inside, he said quietly, and I nodded once. Good, I replied. Then we will not have to repeat ourselves. We walked in together, not rushed, not hesitant, just steady, and I could feel it immediately, the shift in the room when someone unexpected arrives, not loud, not obvious, but present. A subtle change in posture, in conversation, in attention. A few heads turned, then more, and I saw it in their faces. Recognition first, then confusion, then something else they had not yet named, and my son's wife was the first to approach us, her expression tight, controlled, the kind that tries to manage a situation before it becomes visible. "You came," she said, her voice lower than usual, and my son looked at her without anger, without apology, exactly as I had told him. "We were invited," he replied simply, and she hesitated for a fraction of a second, then glanced past him to me. "This is not a good time," she said carefully, choosing each word like it might shift the outcome, and I met her gaze without raising my voice. "It seems like the perfect time," I said, not unkind, just clear. Before she could respond, I saw him across the room, standing near a group of men in tailored suits, a glass in his hand, posture straight, expression composed. The same man who had decided, 2 nights ago, that he had the right to measure someone else's worth in front of an audience, and for a moment I did nothing. I let him see us first. I let the recognition register in his face, slow at first, then sharper, more focused. As he realized we had not stayed away the way he expected, he excused himself from the group and walked toward us, not hurried, not hesitant, but with the confidence of someone who still believed he controlled the room. "I did not expect to see you here," he said, his tone polite, almost neutral, as if the last time we had been in the same space had not ended the way it did, and I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging him without offering anything more than that. "That is clear," I replied calmly, and there was a brief pause, just long enough for the space between us to become noticeable to the people nearby. He glanced at my son, then back at me. "We had a conversation the other night," he said, his voice lowering just enough to suggest privacy, but not enough to remove the audience entirely, and I nodded once. "Yes," I said, "you did," and I let that sit there, exactly as it was. Because sometimes the most effective response is simply to hold someone inside their own words long enough for others to hear them too. He shifted slightly, not much, but enough for me to see the first crack in his certainty. "Perhaps this is not the place to revisit it," he added, and I allowed myself the smallest pause before answering, just enough to make the next sentence land exactly where it needed to. "You chose the place," I said quietly, my voice steady. "I am simply respecting that decision." He held my gaze for a moment longer than before, and I could see it now. Not doubt, not yet, but calculation, the quiet shift of a man trying to understand whether he was still standing on solid ground, and I did not rush to fill the silence. I let it stretch just enough for the people around us to begin noticing that something was not aligning the way it should. "If you have something to say," he said finally, his tone still controlled, but tighter than it had been a moment ago, "we can discuss it privately," and I gave a small, almost thoughtful nod, as if considering the offer. "We could," I replied, "but I think it would be more efficient to keep this exactly where you chose to begin it." There were a few more eyes on us now, not many, but enough. The kind of attention that does not interrupt but does not leave either, and I could feel my son beside me, still, steady, doing exactly what I had told him, not reacting, just present. The man exhaled slowly, adjusting his posture in a way that suggested he was trying to regain control of the moment. "I believe there has been a misunderstanding," he said, and I tilted my head slightly, not dismissing him, just allowing the statement to exist. "No," I said quietly, "there has not." That landed exactly where it needed to, not loud, not aggressive, just undeniable, and for the first time, he did not immediately respond. I reached into my bag then, not quickly, not dramatically, just a simple, deliberate motion. And when I brought the folder out and placed it on the nearest table between us, I did not open it right away. I let it sit there, visible, ordinary, unremarkable to anyone who did not know what it contained. "You spoke about names," I said, my voice even measured. "About what they carry, what they are worth," and he watched the folder now, not touching it, not yet, but no longer looking at me alone. Yes, he replied, more cautiously this time. I believe that is an important conversation, and I nodded once, acknowledging that without agreeing with the premise behind it. It is, I said, especially when the person speaking believes they understand the full picture. I opened the folder then, turning it just enough so that he could see the first page, the header, the address, the details that do not shout but do not hide either, and I watched his eyes move across it, slower this time than my son's had been, more careful, more guarded. And then I turned the next page and the next, not rushing, not explaining yet, just allowing the information to exist in front of him. I am not sure I follow, he said after a moment, but his voice had changed, not in volume, but in certainty. There was less of it now, less assumption, and I met his gaze again, steady, composed. That does not surprise me, I replied, because you have been speaking about something you never actually verified. I tapped the document lightly with one finger, not to emphasize, but to anchor the moment. The property you are standing in, I said, the land your business operates on, the agreements that allow you to host events like this one. All of it is held under a structure you have clearly never examined closely enough. He looked down again, this time more intently, his eyes scanning the lines with a different kind of focus, and I saw it, the exact moment the pieces connected, not all at once, but enough to shift the ground beneath him. This is, he began, then stopped. Reading again, confirming what he was seeing, and I finished it for him, just as I had for my son that morning, managed by me. I said calmly, and the words did not need to be louder than that, because the weight of them carried on their own. The air around us changed then, not dramatically, but undeniably, a subtle tightening, a quiet awareness that something had just been revealed that did not fit the version of reality most people in that room believed, and he straightened slightly. Not out of confidence, but out of necessity. I was not aware of this arrangement, he said carefully, choosing each word with more caution than before, and I gave a small nod, not unkind, not triumphant. Just factual, that is clear, I replied, which makes your certainty the other night even more interesting. There was no anger in my voice, no raised tone, just a quiet precision that left very little room for him to reposition himself without acknowledging what had already been said, and I let a brief silence follow, not to pressure him, but to give him the space to understand what had just shifted, because understanding is always more powerful when it arrives on its own rather than being forced. Finally, he looked up again, meeting my eyes with something new, not authority, not dismissal, but awareness, and I held that moment exactly where it was, because this was the point where words stop being about opinion and start being about consequence, and I said, just as calmly as before, you spoke about what our name was worth. And I let the next sentence land without hurry. Now you have the opportunity to reconsider that statement with complete information. He did not respond immediately, and that was the moment I had been waiting for. Not the shock, not the realization, but the silence that comes after a man understands he has already said too much in the wrong direction. His eyes moved once more across the document, slower now, more careful, as if the details might shift if he looked at them differently, but they did not. They stayed exactly where they were, clear, precise, indifferent to his previous certainty. And when he finally looked back at me, there was no trace of the tone he had used 2 nights ago, no trace of that easy dismissal, only a measured awareness that something had changed in a way he could not immediately correct. It seems, he said carefully, that there are elements of this arrangement I was not fully informed about, and I gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the statement. That is one way to describe it, I replied, my voice steady, neither sharp nor soft, just exact. The people around us had not moved away, not entirely. Conversations had lowered, attention had shifted just enough that the air carried a different weight now, the kind that does not interrupt but does not ignore either, and I let that remain, because this was never about making a scene, it was about making something clear in the same space it had been questioned. My son stood beside me, still, composed, his silence now intentional, no longer uncertain. And I could feel the difference in him without needing to look. The way a person stands when they understand they are no longer alone in the way they thought they were. I would prefer, the man continued, choosing each word more deliberately than before, that we revisit the conversation from the other evening with a clearer understanding on both sides, and I allowed myself a brief pause before responding, not for effect, but for accuracy. There is no need to revisit it, I said calmly. You said exactly what you meant to say. That settled between us with a quiet finality, not aggressive, not dramatic, just undeniable, and for a moment he did not have anything immediate to replace it with. I reached forward then and closed the folder, not abruptly, just a simple, deliberate motion, and slipped it back into my bag, because what needed to be shown had already been seen, and what needed to be understood had already begun to settle. What matters now, I continued, my tone unchanged, is not what you said, but what you choose to do with that understanding going forward. He straightened slightly, not in resistance, but in adjustment, as if recalibrating himself within a space that no longer felt entirely his. I assure you, he said, that I take matters of this nature very seriously. And I met his eyes without hesitation. I believe you do, I replied, which is why I expect your actions to reflect that. There was no threat in the words, no raised voice, just a quiet expectation that carried more weight than anything louder could have. He gave a small nod then, the kind that signals acknowledgement rather than agreement, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Because there was nothing left to clarify without repeating what had already been made clear, I turned slightly toward my son then, not needing to say anything to him, just a brief glance, and he understood, the way people do when something has settled into place inside them, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to stand on. We should go, I said simply, and he nodded, stepping back with me as we turned toward the exit, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady, the same way we had walked in, as we moved through the room. I could feel the shift in how people looked at us, not openly, not dramatically, but differently, the kind of difference that comes when a quiet assumption has been corrected without noise, without spectacle. Outside, the night air felt colder than before, cleaner somehow, and my son exhaled slowly as we reached the car, his shoulders lowering just enough to show the weight had shifted, not disappeared, but moved. I did not know, he said quietly, more to himself than to me. And I opened the car door before answering. You were not supposed to, I said, then paused for a second before adding, not until it mattered. He looked at me then, really looked, not with confusion anymore, but with something steadier, something closer to understanding. He thought he was above us, he said, and I gave a small, measured nod as I got into the driver's seat. He thought he understood what a name meant, I replied, starting the engine, my voice calm as ever. Now he has something more accurate to work with. We sat there for a moment before pulling away, the building behind us growing smaller in the mirror, and I added, almost quietly, the kind of sentence that does not ask to be remembered but stays anyway. A name is not what people say about you when they feel powerful, I said, my eyes on the road ahead. It is what still stands when they realize they are not.